Continuing with our outline of the different types of norms following from today's lecture, we must consider the norms that are expressed in codes of ethics and laws. Codes of ethics and codes of conduct express standards, rules, and expectations that are established by our professional associations, organizations, institutions, corporations, or firms to set the normative bar for carrying out our employment functions. They're helpful in ensuring competency, public trust, and a high level of behavior in a professional capacity. I've placed 22 sample codes of ethics online on Nexus for your perusal, and these might be helpful for you in writing your term paper, where one of the options is to provide a critical evaluation of a code of ethics. I'll talk more about the term paper a little later in the course. For now, we've got to ask ourselves, with formal rules as expressed in Code of Ethics for professional and business practice already in place for us to follow, why is it still necessary to have the ability to critically analyze situations calling for moral deliberation? Well, there are several reasons. While adherence to professional and corporate codes of ethics and conduct is part of what it means to be a professional and to practice professionally, we have to realize that codes of ethics and conduct are not all comprehensive. They may not apply to genuinely new situations never encountered before. They're sometimes very general, broad, and vague, and also they must be interpreted. As one observer has commented, the ability to rationally analyze situations is crucial. Codes of ethics must be interpreted, and they sometimes contain contradictions within themselves. Professionals need more than just formal lists of rules. They need to be able to interpret the rules and apply them to specific issues that arise. This, in turn, requires the ability to think clearly and logically. Given that these codes of ethics need to be interpreted, well, it's going to be very difficult for us to come up with a scientifically objective interpretation of any given statement that is in one of these things. Many codes of ethics are vague, as we said in class. As I read to you the statement in the Boeing Code of Conduct, Boeing will conduct its business in an ethical and proper manner. Well, this is very vague. What does this all mean? It doesn't say. Another observer claims that codes are imperfect. They overstate, they understate, they distort, they leave out, they address only issues that are already part of our consciousness. They are necessarily limited by the modes of thought of the era. They reflect systemic and personal biases, and they say nothing about situations that have not yet arisen. They may provide general guidelines for us to follow, but they do not tell us how to behave in every action. They do not and cannot apply to every situation. Also, codes of conduct and rules can be changed when they're no longer justified. Furthermore, they're often filled with a lot of rhetoric and filler, quite frankly, about how proud we should be to serve in the company that we work for. So while codes of ethics are very helpful and do provide some positive guidelines for our actions, they can't be seen to be all-comprehensive for this purpose, all-comprehensive in guiding our actions as employees, managers, and as business professionals. I turn now to laws, which is the last type of norm that we'll take up. Laws express binding, enforced norms or prescriptions for what you cannot do in society. They may be enshrined in the criminal code with penalties for behavior that runs counter to them, ranging from economic sanctions like fines, to political sanctions like stripping of rights and credentials, to physical sanctions, for example, restrictions of movement such as incarceration, putting a person in jail. They're meant to protect the public in general. Laws are established by society based on what it deems unacceptable if order is to be maintained in it, if cooperative social living is to be maintained for the good of all. There are public legal precedents of punishment for your bad conduct. We generally know the punishment for our infractions when it comes to laws, when it comes to breaking laws. A speeding ticket depends on how fast we were going, and there's an established calculus for how much you're going to get fined. Or if you commit first-degree murder, you'll get life in prison or 25 years to life in prison, and in the United States, there's a very small chance that you'll get the death penalty. All these kinds of things are established, that you know in advance what types of punishments might be given to you should you be caught breaking the law. The concept of a norm is distinct from the notion of a law. Laws express and enforce norms. Norms can be viewed as the larger umbrella concept. Norms may have the potential of becoming laws for which there are strict sanctions or punishments for non-compliance. As you know, there are great diversities among societies in respect to laws. For example, if you're found by a police officer to be possessing a small amount of marijuana for personal use in Canada, generally you won't receive a criminal record. But if you're in Indonesia, you might expect a 25-year sentence in a dark, dank cell. Even if there are also many similarities in terms of laws in the different countries, most, for example, have strict penalties for murder and theft. So there's similarities, but there's also differences, and the differences are going to affect how we must approach international business. We might ask again, why can't business persons just look to the law and the regulations established by societies and governments for guidance as to what is ethically acceptable? Well, we should certainly abide by the law, but again, laws and regulations can be overturned. They're not fixed and final. For example, the Conservative federal government made substantive changes to the Navigable Waters Act, which is part of environmental regulations, to make it easier for developers to construct buildings and industrial facilities, including oil pipelines near lakes and rivers. Also, on some issues in respect to the conduct of business, in respect to new emerging fields and technologies that society has not yet confronted, there is no current legal guidance or legislation. For example, the recent development of epigenetic drugs by the pharmaceutical industry brings up moral issues that have not yet been explored by society. Given the relation between the epigenome and the genome, we might ask whether epigenetic drugs and drug trials ought to be considered genetic therapy, which would be heavily scrutinized under Canadian regulations and laws. Another problem arises in international business, where in certain countries legislation has not yet been enacted in relation to some identifiable issue here in North America that has been acted on. For instance, legislation has been enacted in North America intended to limit the sulfur dioxide emissions that cause acid rain. Regulations like these may not have been legislated overseas. We might ask, would it be acceptable for us to breach the North American limits for such emissions? And we might ask whether or not, if we did, would it be morally unsound? Another factor in answering this question is why can't business persons just look to the law? Well, some laws may only establish the minimal moral requirements for action, where we ought to conduct ourselves even more appropriately. For example, again, the laws we may encounter overseas may be less stringent than in North America, or vice versa. And we shouldn't just assume that doing the barest of minimums or meeting the lowest requirements and complying with the law is representative of moral action. Lastly, some rules and laws are simply unethical. Just because a particular rule is codified doesn't mean that it's right. For example, the fugitive state laws of 1850 in the United States, which established that citizens must help in the return of slaves to their masters when they have escaped from them, is an example of an immoral law. This law codified that every individual is to be complicit with the system of slavery that existed, something that hopefully you'll agree is totally unethical. So given that we cannot depend absolutely on regulations, codes of ethics, and laws in guiding our actions, as business persons and potentially as professionals, we must cultivate our abilities to engage in critical moral deliberation, and we must cultivate our moral imaginations. We all must navigate norms, and sometimes it's comfortable just to follow the established norms of our community blindly, or to be on moral autopilot. We don't have to think. but moral agents see it as their duty to evaluate, criticize, and judge norms in discriminating right from wrong. It's not that moral agents reserve the right to break laws, because they are generally deemed to provide the order that holds a society or organization together by way of a common set of values. Rather, for moral agents, it's necessary to deliberate critically about morally problematic norms and laws, and to promote societal change, progress, and growth where needed. Many of the norms we have identified overlap, work together, and some are in conflict. But for those engaging in critical moral deliberation, none can be seen as absolute. Although we must all navigate norms, moral agents reserve the right to evaluate, criticize, and judge norms in discriminating right from wrong. All in all, the discipline of business ethics involves asking, what are the ethical obligations of business persons and of business professionals? And in this class, we're asking about the ethical obligations pertaining to business persons who may or may not be members of professions or deemed to be professionals. There is some overlap between professionalism and ethical obligation that we'll get into a little bit later. We note now that even if we as business persons for the most part follow all established norms, situations are inevitably going to arise in which their limitations are exposed. There will be situations in which an individual may face conflicting obligations in his or her role as a business professional, and will have to make decisions about which ones to follow and which ones to neglect. For example, there's a conflict between confidentiality and loyalty to our corporation as against a concern for public safety in cases where somebody is contemplating blowing the whistle or going to the media and revealing confidential information that ordinarily should be kept secret in the firm. Because we're all individuals who are ultimately responsible for our actions, our abilities for moral imagination and critical moral deliberation need to be cultivated. And they're the ideal for this course. They offer this additional layer of ethical scrutiny on our actions above and beyond all the norms that we've taken up. So please continue to video lecture 1A pertaining to Patricia Warhain's defense of the need for moral imagination in the business context. Take care.